You know, it always. And the Lord said, Hallelujah. So it's great to be in Florida. When we left, whenever that was, last Tuesday, so we're in a drought, right, in New Mexico. We haven't had any rain in almost a year practically, and we had a little bit of snow. But of course, the morning we have to go to the airport, it snowed 6 inches. The roads were ice. They hadn't been plowed. It's 4:30 in the morning. Oh, like, oh, really? It's 21 degrees. But my son-in-law is state police. So I figured we're in good hands, and he drove us to the airport. We got there in one piece and landed in Jacksonville, and it was 77 degrees. That's about the good part of airplane travel, right? You can get to. This is my husband, Michael. He will be making commentary throughout this. But I want to let you guys know. I mean, I know you know how blessed you are to live in Florida, but I really want you to know how blessed you are in Florida. And if you think of it, pray for our state. I'm from New Mexico. We've been shut down tight, stay at home for 10 months, and the state is dying. We have lost the number one industry really in our state is small business. And of course, you all know all the big box stores got to stay open and all the small businesses closed. So hundreds and hundreds of businesses in New Mexico will never open again. Our schools are not open, none, zero, nada. So the learning has stopped. Kids are basically truant. They're not even online. My family lives on the same property as us, and they've taken in their niece, my son-in-law's niece, and she hasn't had any kind of instruction in 8 months. She's so far behind, she'll probably never catch up. 15 years old. We are the number one state for suicide. And recently, I don't know if you are aware that the administration just is going to ban oil and gas on the federal lands. And the number one revenue source for the state of New Mexico, 50% of our revenues come from the oil and gas leases, and all of them are on federal land. So our state is just, right now the legislature is meeting, and it's never a good thing when Congress or the legislature is in session. Can we all say amen? I wish they were never in session. But we are the number one late-term abortion capital in the United States. And now they're going to remove all guardrails out of whatever the law we have now. They're ready to enact a very, very draconian euthanasia bill. We are the only state that has a Green New Deal, so now they're coming at us with crushing laws to enact. So, for instance, you won't be able to build a house in New Mexico unless you put in solar panels and have an electric station for your car. Okay? So imagine if you're a builder contractor here, you're adding $100,000 to every house that you're building. And this is just to say, you know, we don't realize how important, yes, we do now, rulers are, leaders are. And we've been blessed in the United States to be able to vote in our own leaders. This has never been in the course of human history. You don't find this anywhere in human history, going all the way back to the early Sumerians, which are the first people group that we have any idea about living in a society. Nobody got to vote for who their leaders were. And you lived under oppression. Whoever the ruler was, the empire was, you just lived under that. And so in the course of human history, this has been the greatest thing that has ever happened. And look what we've done to it. Okay? So I'm going to mix up a little the ancient world with the current world, if that's okay with you. I'm kind of an out-of-the-box teacher, and you may hear things you don't agree with, and I'm perfectly fine with that. Just please do not throw rotten eggs or whatever. Don't report in anywhere. I've been at this for 41 years. I grew up in a Jewish home in Canada. Yes, most of the time. So at a very early age, I went to Hebrew school. I learned all the prayers. I learned Hebrew, and we celebrated the feasts. And early on in my life, we also went to synagogue every Shabbat. As I got older, my parents they went less and less. So I had a very, that was my foundation. And we actually lived in a Gentile neighborhood. We were the only Jewish family. And I did experience early on some measure of persecution because people didn't know what to make with a Jewish family in a Gentile neighborhood. And so, for example, at Christmas, my mother would send me out to all the neighbors, and they had all these presents for me under the tree because the mothers felt sorry for me because I didn't have any. So I would go out and collect all these gifts, and then I would go back home, and surprise, surprise. So that was an interesting experience. But for a Jew to come to Yeshua the Messiah is not an easy thing. So it was a long journey for me. I won't bore you with it today, but if you go on my website, Foundations in Torah, I do have my whole testimony story because it's fairly wild. But how many of you have heard it before? Okay, just a couple here, because I ended up many years in the hippie movement. Okay, so I'm dating myself now. And actually, my husband and I talk about it and say it actually was a good thing because we know how to rebel. And 'tis the season to rebel. You know what I'm saying? So we got the chutzpah. We can't understand why everybody just dutifully follows along with the party line. We're like, no way. So we were at rallies, all summer, and I'm pretty politically active. I don't hold back, but I won't go too much there in this session. But it pays to be able to resist. And I would say it's interesting when we look at the Bible and the ancient world and the Hebrew people, they spent more time living under oppression than they didn't. Okay, when you go all the way back, they spent a whole lot of years in Egypt, exiled out of the land in Egypt, oppressed eventually by Pharaoh. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, of course, they were taken captive by the Babylonians and hauled off. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. We really only have about 500 years from the time of basically King David to King Zedekiah of Judah, when the children of Israel lived in the land and had their kings. But half the time they had terrible kings, so it wasn't great either, even though they were in the land. So Israel is kind of a little petri dish to sort of show us what it's supposed to be like, how you operate, how a kingdom government operates with God ruling over them. But they flunked pretty well, more than they were successful. I'll say amen. So we've kind of flunked too, okay? And we've got to figure out how to get back. Folks, we are headed for some very dark days. I'm not going to hold back on this. Things are going to get a whole lot worse. We're going to find out in short order what it's like to be Chinese. You know what I'm saying? And so what happened to the church in China? Well, of course, it's exploding, the underground church. They say upwards anywhere from 2 to 5 million are believers. Now, they worship underground. There was a period of time when the state would build churches for them and they could worship. But now, if you go into a church in China, a state-owned church, and at the pulpit, everything is surveilled. Like you are on camera when you're at the pulpit. If you're teaching or if you come up, you're not allowed to pray for people in the pulpit. So what they do in China, especially in the underground church, literally someone at lunch hour will go and they will pick up someone on a corner, and then they will drive around, Shanghai or something, and they will spend time praying and worshiping God. And then he'll drop that person off and go pick up someone else. And this is what they all do, all lunch hours in China, because they've got to operate underground. And folks, we're coming to a time we're going to have to operate underground. Now, I want to say we have got to detach ourselves from the current culture. Let me also say that culture, politics is downstream from culture. It all starts with culture, and it ends up at politics. So if we go back, the church, over the course of about 100 years, began to just pull itself out of the culture and just left the culture to turn into a sewer heap. And then the politics follows that. And where we are today is let me just mention, I have a ministry called On Fire Prayer. Got a couple of my ladies in here. In March of 2019, I was involved with a political super PAC. and I actually was invited to go to a conference down at Mar-a-Lago, of all places. I actually ate in Trump's dining room. I have pictures to prove it. But he wasn't there, unfortunately. But so we were trying to build a super PAC for the election. Well, it all fell apart. The people in charge, typical, right? The people in charge just didn't run it well, and it never got off the ground. I was supposed to serve on their faith council, and it just, was so discouraging. I'm like, really? I did all this. I spent all this money. I came all this way, and nothing happened. However, something very important happened, because it was at that when I was there that God raised up a ministry called On Fire Prayer, which He had me lead. I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing, but put out the word, and basically right now we have 260 team leaders across the United States, and even some in Israel. And each team leader is responsible to take the text that I send them out to their teams. So some teams are very small, 2 and 3 people, and other teams, we have a team in Texas, 75 people. And so the texts, I only have 1,000 characters, so it's pretty tricky. You got to be tight there. But I send them out, and I have when it started, I felt the Lord say, do not use Facebook and all of that stuff. But I have a program that I use called Project Broadcast, in which a couple, Christian conservative couple, started. And so I haven't had to worry that we're going to get taken down, because I've been in Facebook jail for almost a month, and I just got kicked off of Twitter. So I'm trying all this other stuff, but it's very difficult because we're being censored in every corner. In a way, I just read about a guy, I don't know if some of you saw this, in 2016. Now, the guy was a bit on the shady side, I will admit. I think he was kind of anti-Semitic. Okay. So, however, he put out some memes against Hillary Clinton in 2016. Now, folks, these are memes. He was recently arrested by the FBI. He's up charges for 10 years for basically violating people's constitutional rights to vote. You're going, I don't even know what to say about that. But that's where we are. We're in very scary territory. And so On Fire Prayer, I didn't forget, On Fire Prayer, the Lord, I don't like to say the Lord told me, because half the time I don't know if He told me or not. You know what I'm saying? I hear something, is that you or is that me? But this was an impression that was very strong, and the main thrust of the ministry was to pray for election integrity. This was March of 2019. I had no idea. You know what I'm saying? And so every week, the text that went out would include praying for election integrity. And of course, all that went on, and I'm not commenting on that, but you know what I believe. And I'm saying, Lord, what was the point of that? Was this just an exercise in futility for 20 months? And I realized, and certainly we weren't the only group, but I realized that what the Father was doing, the greatest thing that He can do is put sunlight on darkness. And He has showed us the dark underbelly of the United States of America. That every single institution we have has been totally corrupted to where there's nothing left. Even the church has been corrupted. In fact, there's a movement within the church. You're familiar with the emerging church, seeker-friendly church. What's the other name? I just forgot. But all these guys that are running, Rick Warren's kind of the guy who sort of pushed that narrative. That part of the church, which I was watching a documentary, they're calling the submerging church. But it's in bed with the globalists, okay? And it's this peace movement, tied to the globalists, tied to Islam, and they've just drank the Kool-Aid. So the church is really, and I'm not saying all churches and all people, you understand, this is a general statement, but the church has been corrupted as well. It's become a giant corporation. I don't really see a whole lot of difference between it and a lot of our other corporations. So basically, we got nothing left, but we have everything left. Amen. And the church is going to grow now in America like we've never seen. And it is in the crucible and the fire of persecution in which this thing is going to grow. And so, with fear and trembling, the Lord has His hand on all of this. Now, I'm not a big fan of God is in control. I hear people say that all the time. God is sovereign, but God works through his people. And we're the ones that mess up. Okay, and then he's got to clean up the mess. And the only way he can do that is to work through the human heart. And so he is now working through the human heart. And I don't know what's ahead, but I know that we need to prepare. I mean, I've been saying this for 5 years because whatever it is coming. And I was listening to a guy, he's a young mover and shaker. There's a lot of young guys, millennials coming up who are really moving things. I'm excited because I am not a millennial. Okay, I'm like really on the edge of baby boomer towards the war. Okay, so I'm excited about these guys. But he said something, you understand that this is going to take generations to turn around, right? So here's a little phrase. I add Christians to it. But Christian conservatives fight until they lose. Leftists fight until they win. We just give up. We go, oh, it must not be God. Let's see, 10 minutes, he didn't answer my prayer. It must not be God. I must move on. Okay, we don't know the first thing about fighting in the trenches, but I suspect we're going to find out because we are going to have to fight for the next generations. And those of us who are older, we have got to leave a legacy behind in which they can build. And we have failed. Okay, so I want to be real here. I'm real. Okay, and so we have a lot ahead of us. But what he said, one of the things he said was, the way you're going to beat this thing is have lots of kids. Now, obviously, some of us are not going to be doing that, all right? But we have a community at home. Michael and I are the oldest of the community. We are, I don't know, 20 to 30 families with 60 to 70 kids. And I think they're all under 10. So when we have a service, and I teach there from time to time, all the kids sit in the middle and they color. And it's just wild, and you're trying to teach. So I'm going, I guess we're doing it right here because one of the families has 11 kids. Many have 6. So we're in this environment going, okay, Lord, check 1. We are having lots of kids. In fact, 2 of the women just gave birth this past week before we came. So both those families had 6 in them. Now they had 7. The second thing is you must, and even if you're grandmas, you can help out in this regard. There's no way on earth anymore you can send your children to public school. I homeschooled my kids K through 12, and that was back in the 90s. And at the time, I would never have said that to anyone. I wouldn't have said it publicly, but I'm saying it publicly now. There are no options. You have got to remove yourself from the culture. And the greatest sewer heap in the culture is the education system. So, homeschool. And let me just tell you this, our whole group, every single parent homeschools in our group. I'm going, check 2. The third imperative is community. You will not survive this by yourself. This is no time for Lone Ranger Christianity. It will not work. So I know there's communities that are small, some that are big. I know some people, it's very difficult. They are alone. I understand all that, but you have got to find yourself a group of people and build. And I think under the current conditions, probably you're not going to argue over all the stupid stuff we've been arguing about because your very life and family is at stake here, okay? Who cares? Now, on the other side, this isn't the time to go off the grid and insulate and isolate yourself from everything because God sent us go out into the world and preach the good news. So we got to figure out how to balance and protect our community and build up those inside the community and then go out. And if we get our head chopped off, so be it. I didn't mean that. I was thinking about, there's a Chinese missionary, anybody remember Hudson Taylor? You know, going way back. He was a missionary to China. Probably he birthed what's going on in China now. So you understand, China's been under Mao Zedong, the Maoist communism since 1949. So past 70 years. And he went in there and he basically said, this is the format for doing the work of the kingdom. Number 1, it's impossible. Number 2, then it's difficult. Number 3, then it's done. So we are now in impossible stage. We are in a situation in the United States that's out. You look at this, it's impossible. I don't even know how we turn this thing around. Well, I do know, but you know what I'm saying. In day-to-day living, this thing is impossible. But the Lord will make a way when we do our part. So you understand God is not, the tooth fairy. He doesn't come in with a magic wand and go, everything is going to be all right. Christians have this idea that God is just going to come in and just make it all good. That's not how it works. He uses his people to make it work. And so he's called all of us to get out into our communities, if it's one-on-one or whatever it is, to see things changed and restored. And it's going to take a number of generations. As I said, we didn't get here overnight. We're not going back overnight. The other side has been building this global reset thing for over 100 years. If we go back into the late 1800s, Marx started with his whole Communist Manifesto, etc. But his thing was workers of the world unite and, overrun the bourgeoisie and we'll take control over the world. We understand that never happened. So by 1900, it's like, uh-oh, the workers of the world did not take over. But then along came a guy named Antonio Gramsci, and he was an Italian socialist, and he recognized this is how you do it. You infiltrate the institutions, and you take them over one at a time. And basically the first institution that was taken over was education. And you go to guys like John Dewey. And John Dewey goes back to a guy named, you've probably never heard of him, Wilhelm Wundt. He's a professor. He was actually the first behavioral psychologist in the world in Germany. And so his whole thing was he started out with the Prussian school system. And so all of the students in Prussia went to these schools that were like public schools. We're talking 1800s. And what happened was they were all sort of dutiful little military guys for the state. And that's the whole thing. He created this environment in which everybody would serve the state. Behaviorally, the children would conform to the state. And that was birthed in the 1800s. And that's what our public schools do now. Their purpose is to create little automatons, the commodity for the state. And that's another reason why you do not need to send your children to school. They don't need to be a commodity. You know what I'm saying? So he understood and he infiltrated the education system, and it went on from there. And I'm not going to go into a whole history thing, but you understand that all of our institutions, including the United States military, have been compromised and corrupted. And so we're it, folks. We are it. And I say, hallelujah. We got a great task ahead of us, but he promises to equip us for the task. Okay, I totally went off topic. So what I want to do today is just give you some tools. I'm a big picture person, and I think what's happened in Christianity and in the Hebrew roots and the Messianic whatever, we have gotten so focused on just minutia that we've forgotten to step back and say, what's the big picture? What is the big picture that God is presenting to us? I'm going to give you some tools, generally speaking, to kind of help you as you're reading the scriptures and see them in a new way. So one of the areas I've worked hard in is the ancient Near East world. And the reason I've done that is because that's the environment that the Torah and the Jewish people came out of, okay? They're closer to the ancient Near East world than they are to us. Now, that doesn't mean that I want to live in the ancient Near East world. Okay? I have no desire. That was way worse than anything we got going on now. But it's important for us to understand that world first if we're going to have any hope of understanding where we are now. So just indulge me as I kind of give you some things. And this is all be recorded if you want to listen to it again, but it'll help. So first, any of you familiar with Dr. John Walton? Okay, he's a great scholar. I know you. And he is outside the box, and of course there are many that don't like what he has to say. Just because somebody says something you don't like, Christians do the same thing that big tech's doing, right? We shut them down. We don't want to hear your voice because we don't agree with you. How is that any different? A little bit of conviction there, maybe? The Bible is not communicated in our language. Would we all agree? Okay? It is not addressed in our culture. And it doesn't answer questions about the world and its operation from our modern situation. So we got the whole thing backwards. We take our modern situation and we insert it in the Bible instead of taking the ancient situation and figuring out how it will apply today. You see that? This is a big problem. Even the rabbis, God love them, tend to only go back to the Middle Ages for their commentary. I'm talking modern rabbis. You will rarely find rabbis that go back to the ancient Near East world. The closest they'll get, of course, is the 1st century. The Talmud, you have the Gemara and the Mishnah. They will go back to there and read the commentaries, but you can't get them to go any farther back than that. And how many know there's a whole lot of things in the Bible that make no sense? Okay? I'll be the first to admit I don't have it all worked out. But I have discovered that sometimes when I understand historically what's going on in the ancient world, some things are going to make more sense to me now. And I'll share those as we go. So I just want to start with that because this is very important. If you understand that the Bible wasn't necessarily written to us and for us for our modern situation, it doesn't mean that it isn't timeless. Okay. Now this is my thing I just made up recently. You guys are kind of a guinea pig. This is the second time I've taught this. To me, these are the 3 areas we must focus on. Historical patterns, because the historical patterns will tell us everything about today. You can go to any empire and any leader and you're going to see it's identical to what we're experiencing now. So if we go way back to the Sumerians, Sumerians, which is around 5000 BCE, these guys were very advanced. And they created something called city-states. And so they would have their gods would rule over their city-states, and these city-states would become more and more powerful, and then these kings would be representative of each of these city-states. Well, out of that came a guy named Sargon the First. Heard of him? And he was the first, this was the first empire in the ancient world because he amalgamated all the city-states. He conquered the city-states of ancient Mesopotamia and to become the first world ruler, first world empire. And you can go back, and I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but you can go back and read from Sargon moving forward, and you will see every single empire functions the same way. They raise up a tyrant who kills half the people and basically takes control, and the people become serfs. It's not any different, and this is where we're headed, folks. I would say we're in a place, this is not so much communism and socialism where we're headed, but something called corporate fascism is where we're headed. When the state is married to the corporations. This is exactly what happened in pre-World War II Germany. And Hitler, bit by bit, started joining forces with the various corporations. And he would go in there and he'd say, well, the state just wants to help you. And we want you to run your business. We want you to supply the state with what we need. And so the owner of the company would go, okay, well, whatever, sounds good to me. And bit by bit, eventually Hitler would take over each one of these companies and kick out the owners and would basically control everything. And that's really where we're at, and a scary thing indeed. But historical patterns matter. If you want to understand what's going on now, go back and go through all of these empires and see how they functioned and how they operated, and what's going on now will make sense. Biblical principles. How many know that we cannot observe all of the Torah commandments? How many know that we argue over how we observe the Torah commandments, the ones we think we have figured out how to observe? It's not it is about our obedience, but it's more about taking those commandments and helping us understand biblically those principles in our life. And so I think when we take it out of that realm and focus there, sometimes all the arguments go away, right? And it's not, my way or the highway. And that's got to go, or we aren't going to be a unified community if we keep on with that. And finally, what I think to be the most important. I would suggest, this is my opinion, that the Torah is really what we would call wisdom literature. It is filled with the wisdom of God. God gave instruction to the children of Israel. Some would argue it's like a constitution, but the whole idea here was the very essence of the wisdom of God is contained in the Torah. And if we would follow those instructions and apply those biblical principles, He will give us the wisdom we need to go forward. So we have a lot of wisdom literature in the Bible, don't we? Can anyone think of an example of wisdom literature in the scriptures? Proverbs, good example. Anywhere else? Ecclesiastes? Psalms? You could go through all of the prophets. I mean, almost the whole book. Okay, all the books are filled with the wisdom of God, okay, and have an aspect of wisdom literature. Wisdom is really ground zero, I think, in being able to have a roadmap to live. Okay. Another, just briefly, looking at the writer. So we have this idea, we don't tend to look at what the writer is trying to communicate to us, do we? When we read the scriptures, we're more concerned with what we think about it. Would you agree? Okay, that's not the way we're supposed to look at it. Because the writer, I've written several books, so I know my books, when I was first going to write a book on the temple, it was probably about 1,200 pages. I pretty well knew nobody on planet Earth was going to read it. So I'm going, this isn't going to work. So now I got to chop it up and break it down to where it's less than 200 pages, because I know somebody will read that. But I had way more information than I could put in the book. So I had to decide what was important. What did I want to tell you about what I learned? And so I left a whole lot of stuff out. Okay? I felt anyone reading my books now who are maybe in this community, they would know what I was talking about, and it wasn't necessary for me to explain everything. So I left a lot of stuff out. So what I left out sometimes is almost as important as what I put in. The writers are the same. The writers are telling us what is God doing in the world, and they're trying to communicate that to us. And so their interpretation of what they're writing is what is inspired. As we talk about the inspired word of God and that every word is inspired of God, which technically isn't correct. It's what the writer's interpretation is. That's what's inspired by God, what the writer wants to tell us. So the historical events, so when you're reading, say you're reading about Abraham coming out of Ur of the Chaldees, and so we don't have a lot of information. There's a whole lot that's left out, but it has a historical backdrop, right? He was a real guy living in a real place. He had real children that did real stuff. But they were very conserving in what they said about it. They didn't give us the whole story. Lots of things are left out. So what's emphasized, what's left out, and what is embellished are the things that we want to look at. Now, can we always figure out the writer's intent? No, it's not. We weren't there. I don't know. But the Father, when He pours out His wisdom into us and gives us inspiration, we can kind of figure out what is the writer really saying. So that's it's a bit of a different way to look at it. Okay, we talked about this. History repeats itself. Human nature does not. Human nature doesn't change. Okay, so how they acted 5,000 years ago, they act the same way now. And we see a lot of leaders, rulers, and kings that act like children, right? And they still do that. Enough said. The number one thing when you're reading, studying, as they say in real estate, location, 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 context, context, context. You cannot read a verse out of context and make some sort of dogmatic commentary on it. Honestly, and whole denominations have sprung up just by one verse. Is that not the case? I mean, we got Mormonism. I mean, take your pick. We've created entire denominations just out of one verse. So very careful here. Context is important, but you must read it really within the whole of the book. Don't even take it out of a chapter. You look at the chapter, but you need to read the whole book. You understand? To understand, you got to know that the history, the period of time you're dealing with, what's going on, because every period in time in the scriptures is different. If you're in the kings or you're in the patriarchs, they had different cultural milieu that wasn't the same. And so if you don't go look at those things, it's going to be a problem. History, we just talked about. Culture, very important. Language, and of course we know the Bible mostly written in Hebrew, also Aramaic and the Old Testament. And politics. And I would just submit to you that the Bible overall is a very political book. Many would argue with me. Some of you right here are arguing. But if you look at the Bible and you go through chapter by chapter by chapter, the background is always political. The background of every chapter in the Bible has something to do with Israel, that God has preserved and kept to be an influence in the nations and the nations. Okay? So, all through the prophets, what's the backdrop? World empire. Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, you name them. So now, how is Israel supposed to function? Separate from the nations, but in the nations. Right? How do they function when they're in exile and they have some other king ruling over them, like King Nebuchadnezzar? What are they supposed to do? How are they supposed to live? How do they look different? That's the story of the Bible, that God pulled out and separated a people out of world empire to show the rest of the world what it looks like when God is ruling and reigning over them. Of course, we mentioned they flunked often. So, have we flunked? Often. But God always redeems and restores. Is exactly what he did for ancient Israel, isn't it? Amen. So world empire is important. And so the backdrop of the Bible is world empire. Okay? So the question is, how do you upend world empire? How do you subvert world empire? So Yeshua is really our great example. When you look at Yeshua, he enters into the 1st century, doesn't he? Who is the predominant ruling empire? Rome. It ain't great in Rome unless you're up there at the top. How typical, right? Every empire ends up becoming very corrupt. That's just the nature of empires. Become corrupt and tell lies and propaganda. They're all the same. But in the 1st century, there was more than just Rome coming against them. Think about they're living in the land of Israel. Who are they being ruled over within the land amongst the Jewish people? What dynasty is operating in the 1st century? Anybody remember? The Herodian dynasty. Okay, King Herod, he was the one who ended up building the temple. He died off, and his son Archelaus, well, he had a bunch of sons, Philip the Tetrarch, and moved them around the land of Israel. Were they good guys? Not hardly. So now they got to deal with them. And on top of all of that, where was the center of their life? In the temple. This temple was the central institution of their life. Everything happened in the temple. Commerce, the judiciary, obviously all the ceremonies and the priesthood, everything, the religious aspect, everything functioned from the temple. Well, guess what, folks? The temple was totally corrupt. And I mean corrupt. Okay? Anybody remember who the high priest was? He wasn't from the right line. His name was Annas. And he bought and sold and, put in his family into the high priesthood. And they had deals going on with Rome. This was not a good thing. Do you wonder why Yeshua didn't come in and take and sit as a king in that temple? Because it had become totally corrupt. And he wasn't going to, it was going to have to come down. And it did, 70 Common Era. Remember, the temple was destroyed. When he went into the temple and overturned money tables, the money changers' tables, he was basically making a statement against their corruption. And he was not going to sit in that temple as king on throne until that place was cleansed. And how did God clean it? He destroyed it. That's kind of scary. That was his own temple, supposed to be the place of his presence. God and corruption cannot be in the same sentence. You don't think he's looking at all this corruption that's going on here and his heart is not breaking? for what these rulers are going to do to we the people. The one thing about empire rulers is they never care about the folks. The least among us are the ones they never care about. And so our God initially installed kings who would rule righteously and justly, especially for those who had no voice and who were powerless and who were the least among us. And that's why he gives us the task of taking care of the least. That is his heartbeat. That is the opposite of world empire. And so it really comes down to there's only two empires, folks. Kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God, and the kingdoms of this world. And you got to choose. Because you can't have one foot in one and one foot in the other. And that's what we've been trying to do, haven't we? As a church, communities, whatever, you can go on. We've tried to live in the United States with one foot in one world and one in the other and having the best of both. Well, you got the worst of both. And so now we're coming to that inflection point. You must choose whom you will serve and who you owe your allegiance to. Is it going to be the kingdoms of this world, or is it going to be the kingdom of our God? Amen? And that's the bottom line. Okay, I want to talk about this. Let me just say I'm not getting through this whole teaching. Okay? I think I got 3 slides, and it's not happening. So I'm probably going to record it as a teaching, and then you can buy it for now. But let me just try to get through as far as I can. One of the things that people don't look for are the themes that run through the Bible. So the very first one, and I say maybe the most important one, is the concept of creation, decreation, and recreation. So in Genesis chapter 1, that's creation, right? Creation technically should say it's about building a place for the presence of God. That's the purpose of creation. And creation should be equated with a temple. We call it the cosmos. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He created the cosmos, the ordered universe, so he would have a place for his presence. And then he would install his own representative to rule over the earth, which that was Adam. That was his responsibility. And what did he do? He messed up too. And so now everything's contaminated and corrupt. Here we go. Numero uno out of the gate. And so he's exiled out of the garden, isn't he? And so it's protected from his contamination. And so now we enter into a place of decreation. And so God's got to restore the cosmos once again. And so as we go through the period there, I don't know how many years it is, and it doesn't even really matter. But what do we find when we come into the story of Noah? There's a whole lot of corruption going on, right? And the earth has become violent. And so now it's D-Day. God is going to recreate out of the decreation. And so what does Noah do? He builds the ark, and he builds a place for a presence of God. Okay, and he's on the ark. And most scholars would agree that the ark, you all understand the ark was like really big. Okay? And at that period of time, which may be somewhere around 2900, 3000 BCE, the biggest boat on the Euphrates River was 10 feet long. And here's an aircraft carrier. What's wrong with this picture? Okay? So even though in the literal, who knows? I'm not here to argue about that, but in what God is the writer is trying to communicate to us, is that the building of the ark was a recreation of the cosmos. It was a recreation temple pattern. We go back to Genesis chapter 1, God makes all the stuff. Remember, he makes the animals. You remember what day he made the animals on? And so in the ancient world, every temple had 3 parts. So in the cosmic temple, if you will, we have heaven, earth, and sea. Okay? Do you ever wonder why all that, like, for example, in Genesis 19, when it talks about celebrating the Shabbat, that God would rule over the heaven, the earth, and the sea? That's a temple pattern right there. So all temples in the ancient world, doesn't matter where, had 3 levels. So now we go to Noah's Ark. It had 3 levels, right? The upper level, the inner chamber where where Noah and family lived, that's like the inner chamber with the God. The next level was where the animals were, and the bottom level, he didn't want to be there. But everything was designed the same way. So many scholars say, and you don't have to agree, that the ark, because it was so large, it was embellished, it was an image, a picture of the restoration of the cosmos. That quotes Adam in there as a priest and king with his God, and then he comes out, and what does he do? Builds an altar. Let me just mention where the ark, where does it land? Okay, what is Ararat? It's a mountain. Okay, I'm just going to quickly mention this because in the ancient world, mountains always represented government. Okay, and that's because temples were always built on top of the mountain. And so the king, when he sat on the throne in the temple, it was on top of the mountain. So the mountain was like the top of the mountain was like the inner chamber for the king. Let's think about Moses. You remember Sinai mountain? Where is Moses? On top of mountain in cloud. What does that cloud sound like? Think about the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement when the high priest went in there and put the incense was in the shovel on the rock, and he put the incense. I mean the coals were, and he put the incense, and the thing would float. It was all cloud. This is the imagery, cloud and fire, and we had the sapphire paving stone. So it was a picture of the Holy of Holies. And then halfway down the mountain, what did we have? Mount Sinai. What do we have halfway down the mountain? The elders, yeah. So they're sort of they're the priests. And at the bottom of the mountain, we have the folks. They're in the outer courtyard, if you will. They weren't allowed to. The mountain was a sacred space. And so the priest's responsibility was to go from the folks to the king, up and down the mountain, mediating between the two. So the top of the mountain, in the ancient world, the gods would make their temples on top of the mountain. Okay, and then in the temple, they'd have the place where they ate and drank and did all their stuff. I mean, that was that weird. What can I say? But the idea of the top of the mountain was the throne of the god, or the throne of God. Very important. And what was the purpose of the king being seated on the throne? To rule and reign rightly and justly. So the seat of government is on the top of the mountain, and mountains represented government. You can take that to the bank. I hope that changes everything for you, because Yeshua spent a whole lot of time on mountains. And it always would say he went up to the mountain and he sat. You're like, what's that in there for? Because the idea was, as a king sitting on the mountain. Do you remember where the Sermon on the Mount was? Trick question. He sat. He made a big deal about him sitting. And now he's giving them the Constitution. He is upgrading the Constitution, if you will, the Torah. And he's taken it a step farther. He's giving to them his interpretation of the Torah on how they are going to live. And he's doing it seated on the top of a mountain. So anytime you see this mountain language, listen, we always get into arguments in the New Testament about which mountain. Like, how about the Mount of Transfiguration? Who cares what mountain it is? That's not the point. The point of them building the shelters on top of the mountain is because every god built his house on top of the mountain. And now they're building the 3 Sukkot on the mountain, because this is government language. And God, Yeshua, is showing them in the Transfiguration, the top of the mountain, just like Moses when he was on top of Sinai. Can I give you a little hint here? You need to start reading the New Testament as though it's the replay of the Exodus story, because it is. And I did a series called "What Did Yeshua Mean?" Instead of what's the phrase with the bracelet? Thank you. I changed it to "What Did Yeshua Mean?" right? Like, and so I go through Matthew. I think I made it to chapter 7 to show you the pattern of Yeshua replaying Moses all the way through. The Exodus story being replayed in the Gospels. It's so clear when you see it, okay? And it's very important because a lot of the story in Matthew takes place with Yeshua on a mountain because he's communicating what the government of God looks like, okay? Now let me just mention briefly, Yeshua is not a doormat. What we have today in Christianity is what I call doormat Christianity. Just lie down and let them walk over you, right? No way, Jose. And so a lot of us kind of use that as, turn the other cheek and walk the extra mile. I understand all that. But you don't do it lying down and giving everyone what they want and compromising with your faith and making compromise with the culture. This is the number one problem that Israel had, bar none, with every single empire. They compromised, and they didn't look a dime's worth of difference than the culture that they were living in. And that's where we are today. We do not look a dime's worth of difference with the culture out there. We have sacrificed in ways and to look more and more like them than to be separate. So again, I say we've got to figure out a way to separate ourselves from the culture, but still engage it in power. This is a time that God is going to raise up people with courage. We're going to see courage in a way we've never seen it. Winston Churchill once said, "The greatest of all the virtues is courage, because on it all the other virtues are built." And I believe that to be true. Now, do we have courage in the natural? No way. It's going to require God's courage manifested in us to be bold and courageous and to speak when we must speak. I did a series on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Some of you familiar with that? I did that series 2.5 years ago because I knew it was coming. I just didn't know it was coming in 2021. But I thought, well, people need to be prepared because I see all the signs. They're all happening. What happened in World War II Germany, it's all coming back. And so I did this whole series based on the book by Eric Metaxas about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I just laid it all out, and without using political parties, but I compared one political party to the Nazis. And, it was just astonishing to me how similar everything was. So we put it out there. It's been airing on Israel TV Network. I know some of you have purchased it. And I do know Donald Trump Jr. has a copy. I don't know if he ever watched it. It could be in the trash can. I'm not sure. But I knew the signs were there. And one of the things I shared with the group last night, for me, my kids got sick of hearing me. I made them watch every World War II Holocaust movie that ever came out. Okay? And they're like, "Mom, not again." And yeah. He was forced to watch them as well. Remember, I homeschooled my kids, so I know, I still watch them. Well, because thank God we have them. When they sanitize and purge all those, we are in a big trouble. But I grew up in a family. My dad went off to fight. We grew up in Canada, so he actually left home when he was 14 and joined the Canadian Armed Services and ended up being a sergeant at 15. Lied about his age. That's what they did best back then, right? He served in the Italian campaign in Europe, and also was part of the rescue of the guys at Dunkirk. He was part of that, and he drove ambulances in Holland, if you could even imagine such a thing. And of course, that generation came home, didn't talk about any of it. I mean, it was like I couldn't even pry it out of him. Before he passed away, I made sure that my mom had a recording of all of the things that happened, because he simply wouldn't talk about any of it. But that was in my home. And also my uncle, my great uncle Max, was he was in Auschwitz. He was one of the few that actually got out. And, he was damaged goods. He was, and so my DNA really has always been, this is our marker. This is the place in which they're trying to destroy your people. So I always go back there. So now when I start seeing the signs, I've got to warn people because it's going to happen. And now we know, we as Christians and Jews and believers in Yahweh and God are now considered to be domestic terrorists. Okay? It's a coming, folks. You know, it's going to get worse and worse. So we've got to equip ourselves. And here I am, sweeping things. Do you understand the creation, decreation, recreation? So that's what Yeshua, he came, he didn't come, let me put this. It's not about, I'm saved and I'm going to heaven. This is not about this at all. In fact, salvation in the ancient world had nothing to do with what we think of it now. Salvation in the ancient world means the king came, he defeated all the enemies, and you are now under his sovereign protection. That's what salvation means in its basic term. And I don't know if I'm going to get to that in more detail. And so that's, Yeshua came to restore the cosmos, to restore all of heaven and earth and remove the contamination of everything, and basically set himself up in the place of where Adam was supposed to be and supposed to serve. Remember, he's the second Adam. So this is about that kind of restoration, not I'm saved and I'm going to heaven and I have fire insurance and who cares about you? Because we've been there for 100 years. I'm going to just say the rapture theory and all the great tribulation stuff has done a tremendous disservice to all of us, because that's this escape hatch where I'm not responsible for anything. And I don't care about you because I'm going to escape and I'm just going to leave the earth a living HE double hockey sticks. Okay? We have young people here. And so this thing is insidious, and it got in the church, and it has worked its way from the inside out, and it has sabotaged people's ability to go out there and do their job. Yeah? That's all I'm going to say on that. Okay, the second, another area for a sweeping thing is the temple, the building of the temple. It's building a house, but it's more than building a house, it's building a dynasty. Okay? So in the beginning, God built a house, but he was really building a dynasty, his own dynasty. That's what we are a part of. Can you grasp that? We are a part of Yahweh's dynasty. And so that dynasty, look how long it's been going. Like whenever that was back then, I don't know, 5, 6, 7,000 years. I'm not holding to the million billion thing. I mean, that may be real. I don't know, but that's not the argument here. But God's seed that was implanted in Adam, essentially, not, you know what I'm saying. But the seed of the kingship would be passed on from generation to generation to generation. And we see it even in the 400 years where nothing was, where things kind of exited there for a while. That seed never died. And of course, Yeshua was the one who was the seed that would take this thing out to the four corners of the earth through us. Because we are supposed to operate as a kingdom of priests, are we not? And kings and priests. And so I would just suggest, I think we have, this is just my opinion, I think we have a little bit of a warped view of what eternity is. I think the idea of that which is eternal is the ongoing legacy of the seed that never dies, the seed of the kingdom that just keeps going and going and building the dynasty. Does that make sense? Okay? We're sort of looking for, okay, I'm going to die, I'm going to go on the ground, and then I'm going to be raised up, and, I'm not speaking against the resurrection. And I personally, am going to be a living, eternal being, right? Everything's always about me. But I think it's about the kingdom. It's about all parts of it. And so it's the seed that's going to come forth that's part of the kingdom, this eternal seed. Just my opinion on that. The key in house building, dynasty building, is that the family is the very foundation and heart of who God is. Without the family, we got nothing. Nada, zero, bupkis. The family is the key to the whole thing. The dynastic family, when the king passes on to his son the land. And so why on earth, who doesn't understand why world empire, what is their number one target? The human family. Okay, so the human family produces children. So it goes after children to destroy children. And now the reason we have all this insanity with transgendered everything, homosexual everything, all of it is to upend the family. And so how does the family subvert world empire? It has a whole lot of kids, grandkids, all the kids. Because how many know the left is not having babies? The left doesn't have children. Most of them are homosexual. They don't have children. If you go to Europe, I'm telling you, you go to Europe, maybe not right now, but a few years ago, and you went to every world capital in Europe to find who the leader was of that country in Europe, not one of them had children. You went to Italy, you went to the Netherlands, you went to France, England, Switzerland, Austria, or a bunch of others. None of those world rulers, or the rulers of those countries, had children. Isn't that interesting? And that's the goal in all this. I mean, we don't kill them aborting them. You know, we find other ways. All of this goes back to the heart of God. In the beginning, God created heaven and the earth was to produce children, produce life, to produce a house, to produce a dynasty. And everything on the other side is to destroy that. You must remember that. And what's the one thing back in the 60s? What was the people group that they went after? The black community. And what did they do? They took the fathers out of the homes. And did they care? Not a whit. Okay? And have left that community. I mean, it's a community in disarray. It's been decimated. It's heartbreaking. So what they for whatever, I don't understand the necessarily demographics of all of it. They targeted the black community first. And once they took down the black community, then they just started with the rest of the, the cultures. If you remove the father from a home, the family falls apart. And that's where we are. And then what do you do at the same time? You raise up women so they're like some kind of superhero. If I see one more police commissioner on some show that's a woman, I may scream. How many times they're going to go into a building, take out the bad guy? Who's leading the charge? There's this gal. She's got high heels on. Are we kidding? She's got her vest on. She's got her guns a-blazing. And all the guys behind her, the SWAT team, and they got shields and helmets on. But she's out there all by herself. Every time I see that, I just, so listen, it makes me so mad. And this is what we've done. We've raised up women to be exalted and men to be, desalted, exalted, I don't know, the opposite of exalted, desalted. And so now we know for sure everything is completely upside down. And so we restore it because we go 180 degrees opposite of what the world is doing. How am I doing here? I can go to 4:15. Is everybody okay? You're actually awake, so I'm pretty happy because usually by this time, mostly everyone's asleep. So the third thing's very important because I would suggest that the whole of the Bible is all about kingship. That's the master theme from beginning to end, kingship and the line of the kings. Listen, the Bible doesn't spend that much time going into explaining everybody's community, does it? So we start with Adam, messed up, then we get to Noah, and out comes Noah from the boat, and we got the three groups, and they go off. But we only focus on one, really, Shem, right? And out of that, we got Abraham pops up, and then we go, he goes to the land, and then we have his sons, and, and then we move on. Jacob and family goes down to Egypt, and out of that pops out Moses, you know what I mean? We stay focused in on the line of the kings. Those guys are all kings. If you read Genesis 17, I believe it is, it talks about out of Abraham's loins will come kings and princes. And a few verses down, it says, out of Sarah's womb will come kings and princes. This is the line of kings and princes. That's the story of the Bible. And then we go all the way through, and we go all through, the kingdom splits, and we got, David, I already mentioned all that, and then we go through, we come into the Hasmonean period, Hasmonean, depending on how you want to pronounce it. I go both ways. And the Hasmoneans come in, and of course we got the great story of Hanukkah. But guess what? The Hasmoneans went bad. They started doing the same thing that all world empire did. They started killing people. They started expanding territory militarily. And then that leads us into the Herodian period. It's all the same. It's like Groundhog Day. Seen that? Okay? Every day you wake up, it's the same. It's all about kingship, and it's all about enthroning the king. Yeshua's whole life, from the short life that it was, once he was, remember he was immersed in water in Luke 4, I believe. Okay, so he's going to be immersed, and he comes up out of the water, right? There's a dove that lands on his shoulder, and it says, "This is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased." So you should know that this concept of that statement right there is a Mesopotamian adoption ceremony. And so right at that moment, God is adopting Yeshua to be his son, to rule and reign. And in fact, the term Son of God, which we have really done a great disservice to, is a term used in the ancient world for all any son who is going to be raised up to become the king's heir. So, for example, Caesar was a son of God. Okay? All through the ancient Mesopotamian world, all those guys were called Son of God. The Son of God is a title for a king. Okay? It's not all the weird stuff that we think that it is. So right there begins it's an enthronement ceremony, and we go through various parts of his life. I would even submit that his birth is part of the enthronement ceremony, but this is a teaching for another day. But as we go through, and when he is resurrected from the dead, would be the final. And where does he go when he's resurrected from the dead in Acts chapter 1? What mountain does he go to? The Mount of Olives. Okay? He goes up to the Mount of Olives. It's not like he's not flying up into the heavens, with the comets and the constellations. He's going to the top of a mountain. What's the top of the mountain represent? Government, the seat, the throne of God. Why the Mount of Olives? I'm really off course. So on the Mount of Olives, yeah, what a good idea. Why the Mount of Olives? Okay, we got olives. What comes out of olives? Well, untechnically, we are the olive tree. So who was the olive tree in Scripture? Little bit general. It was a person. There was one king who was the olive tree. Good guess. You already read my book. Not fair. So let me just say, kings in Scripture are trees. Okay? This is very common in the ancient world. So you've got this tree, and you got the trunk of the tree, and that represented the divinity of the king. So the best example I can give you is Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel. Do you remember chapter 2? And he's compared to a tree. The tree gets really big, and then the canopy of the tree covers the whole earth. Okay? Trees are kings, and so the canopy represented the sovereignty of the ruler. And so when you came under the shade or the shelter under the canopy of the tree, you came under the sovereignty of that king. Does that make sense? All kings are trees. So you remember the guy in the New Testament? Can't see, and he looks up, and what does he see? Yeah. So that's kingship language right there. And so, I forgot what I was going to say. Someone help me. Olive tree. Thank you. Go to the head of the class. Oh, you are at the head of the class. Okay. So, olive tree. King David. What does the olive tree produce? Oil. What is the oil used? For anointing kings and other people, but we'll focus on the kings. The olive oil is used for anointing kings. So, the Mount of Olives is where all that oil is, right? The Mount of Olives is a very unique place. So, on top of the Mount of Olives was a place called the Rosh, and that was where the altar of what was? Who knows? 10 points. Thank you. You got the 10 points. On top of the Mount of Olives was a place where it was the altar of the red heifer. Remember, they take the ashes and they mix with the water and sprinkle the priest to purify them. And so when in Matthew 24, Yeshua and disciples leave the temple, and where do they go? Where do they go? Matthew 24 actually starts in the end of 23 into 24, and they are all sitting on the Mount of Olives, likely in the place of the altar of the red heifer. Okay, so now I got to go way back. Abraham. Abraham, he built an altar on what mountain? Mount Moriah, right? And that's where the temple would be. Jacob, remember, Jacob lay down with the head on the stone, which I've never figured that one out, but anyways, I prefer my pillow. But I couldn't resist. Make sure you buy them. So he built, he's the altar, and then Jacob also with the altar. But it says something interesting about Abraham. It says that he goes to the east and he builds an altar. Goes to a mountain to the east and builds an altar. Where did he go? He was at Mount Moriah, and then he goes to the mountain to the east. Mount of Olives. Now, I think Abraham is way before Yeshua, right? That place was already a place, a sacred place where the presence of God dwelled. And so Abraham built an altar to God. Now, this is just going to be my opinion. I did write about it, but we have the story of Abraham and Isaac going up the mountain. It's kind of a fairly bizarre story, right? And they go to the top of the mountain. We don't know. It says in the region of Moriah, so it doesn't necessarily mean that it was on top of Mount Moriah. I would submit that the mountain that they went to was the Mount of Olives. Okay? And I would also submit that it was an enthronement ceremony for Isaac. Because take your son, the one whom I love, and take him to this place on top of the mountain, right? And build an altar for me. And so we have this imagery of the resurrection, all this stuff going on. I believe that it was a picture of Isaac being enthroned, and that Yeshua would replay what happened with Isaac, right? On top of the same mountain. If in fact it is the Mount of Olives, which I believe it was. Now, another important thing about the Mount of Olives, what did they do on top of the mountain at every month? We needed to determine the moon, right? Once it was determined, what did they do? They lit a fire on top of the Mount of Olives in the same spot, no doubt. They lit signal fires to let everybody know that the new moon had been spotted, and now we can determine the month and we would know when to celebrate the festival. And so they'd light the signal fire on top of the mountain, and then they would mountains farther out in the country, they would light so that everybody knew. And they say they lit the signal fires all the way to Babylon, which I don't know if that's true or not. Doubtful. But that was the idea. So now we have a fire on top of the mountain as well, the place where Yeshua would be resurrected. Going back to Moses, did he replayed the story of Moses, because Moses was on the mountain in a fire in a cloud with God, face to face, mano a mano. Do you understand? There's so much in here that Yeshua is replaying the Exodus story. This is the reason why he died at Passover and was raised from the dead at Passover. Could have been any festival. I mean, we often say, well, why not Sukkot? Because we're not replaying that. We're replaying the story of the Exodus. So, for example, Luke 4, I believe, when we got Yeshua and who going knocking heads in the adversary, the Hasatan, right? The adversary. Okay, so stop thinking of Hasatan as some guy running around, making your life miserable. Although he is making your life miserable, that would be, in the ancient world, the serpent was associated with the rulers or the kings over the empire. And this is probably going to make some of you upset, but that's okay. So, for example, you think of Pharaoh. What did he wear on his headdress? Yeah, the uraeus. So the Pharaoh was identified with the serpent. Okay? So now we have this whole drama with Yeshua and the serpent, right? Challenging one another. Let me mention something in the story, Exodus, you've all been reading because it's a Torah portion. It talks about God, Adonai, hardening Pharaoh's heart, right? Like, that's weird. What does that even mean? And there's lots of discussion. But if you don't put it back in its cultural context, it's not going to mean a whole lot. The Hebrew word there is not, it's not the normal word you use for harden. It's actually from the root chazak, which means be strengthened. So now it says God strengthened Pharaoh's heart. But really what it's saying is that Pharaoh rose up in strength to oppose God. Okay? So now this story that we have with Yeshua going battling against the serpent, right, for the kingdom and the bread and all the stuff, where does he go? He goes out to the wilderness to do battle with the serpent. Is a replay of Moses doing battle with Pharaoh out in the wilderness. Okay? All of this stuff is tucked away in there. This is the way the writers chose to write about it. It's just unfamiliar with us, to us, and we don't really see it in those terms. So, like I said in that series that I did, I went through probably line by line in the first 7 chapters of Matthew to show you, like, how does the story of Yeshua start out? Who's killing all the babies? Herod. And how does the story of Moses start out? Okay? Because Yeshua is going to replay the story of the Exodus. The story of the Exodus is the most important story, bar none, for the Jewish people of deliverance. It's why we tell it every year at the Passover. But that is in the DNA of the Jewish people, is the story of the Exodus. So I find it very interesting that right now in time in the United States, with everything that's going on, that we're reading Torah portions in Exodus. And there's a number of teachers. I know Bill Cloud's been teaching on that and several others, but it's no small thing. But that's where we're. So how do we get out of all this? We must restore the covenant. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I'm only 6 more minutes. You with me? 6 more minutes? Okay. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Is a covenant statement. Okay, it's whenever you have a covenant, you have 2 parties that join together, right? They are yoked together. And when the 2 parties yoke together, each takes on the other's name and the other's identity. When you break the covenant, you lose your identity. And the greatest shame in the ancient world was to lose your name and your identity. So every time Israel messed up at home, what did God do? Took them into exile, Babylon or Assyria, and what happened? They would lose their name and their identity. And look at what happened to Assyria. Like, you don't even know who's who anymore. Okay? This was the greatest shame, bar none, to lose your identity and lose your name, because that's what a covenant gave you. And so this covenant starts out with, it's not just about heaven and earth. It does seem kind of weird. Like, how do heaven and earth meet and produce babies? Right? With me? You should wake up on that one. That's kind of weird. You go down into chapter 2, it says, these are the toldot of the heavens and the earth. You remember that? When God created them. Well, the word toldot means to bring forth children. So how on earth do heavens and earth bring forth children? Right? Is that kind of weird? That's not, it's because it's not talking about a literal physical heaven and a literal physical earth. It's talking about a covenant between two parties. The party of heaven, which represents God, the king, the party of earth, which represents his subjects. It's about a covenant that's being made with the king and his subjects. And what that, if the subjects are his heirs, what is the great promise that the king gives to his heirs? The most important thing in all of the ancient world, and important now, what is the one thing that is given? The land. Every king gave to the one who would inherit the land. And so God was giving to his subjects the whole earth as their inheritance. Okay? And then we see kings going and giving. So this coming together in covenant was between God and his people. And they were to produce life. We talked about the human family. That was the whole purpose of the covenant. So a covenant produces life. It makes you fruitful and multiply and bring forth children, or however that. To confirm a covenant was to eat a meal. We go back to Exodus chapter 12, coming out of after the plagues, which is, all the chaos that got created with the plagues. And what do? It's the Passover. And they apply the blood where? And in the threshold, they would slit the throat of the lamb and the blood would run down. So basically, they were covering the entire doorway with blood. And the doorway eventually came to represent the altar. And they would splash the blood on the four sides of the altar. The doorway signified the altar. Doorways were very important in the ancient world. It was where the king would sit to allow those who entered in or not. When you crossed over the threshold, you entered into the kingdom, and the king determined whether you were going to be a citizen of that kingdom or not, and it always happened in doorways or boundaries of some kind. So the blood is applied, and then the meal is eaten, and the meal signifies that that covenant has been restored. The blood shed and applied meant the covenant was renewed, and the meal eaten meant the covenant was confirmed. So I'm going to say the way this whole thing gets renewed is when and of course, what is our way? How do Yeshua's blood was shed, but now we have a mechanism to restore the covenant. What is that mechanism? It's called repentance. That's how you restore the covenant. And yes, you do it individually, but you also do it corporately. And corporately has much more power, I think. And as I mentioned to the group last night, I find it very interesting because in November of 1620, the Pilgrims came across the Atlantic in their boats. They passed the Mayflower Compact, which was a covenant between them and their God, and gave this land. And that everything was birthed out of that moment. And here we are exactly. Go back to Abraham in Genesis 15. How long were they going to be in Egypt under oppression? 400 years. Now, they weren't under oppression for the entire 400 years, were they? They were under oppression, maybe, we don't know, 200 and some. But then the last 200 and some were not good, did not go well. And so here we are again at 400-year point. Just kind of interesting, in which a covenant must be renewed. The covenant that the Pilgrims made with the land and with their God, that covenant needs to be restored once again. So not only restoring a Mosaic covenant or restoring the Mayflower covenant, the covenant needs to be restored in order for us to be restored as a people. And it all begins there. I really do believe that. And this is the key. This is really the key. Restoration of the heavens and the earth, the place of the presence of God. And that's the place where we can approach and draw near. So I got through 4 slides. I only have 36 more, so I'll just have to come back. Okay. I'll take a couple of questions, but only related to the topics. I don't answer questions I don't want to. Anybody got any? You know, I sort of covered a lot of ground here, but I only gave you a tip of the iceberg. So there's a lot more here. You can buy my books. They're still on Amazon, so don't throw stones. I'm trying to figure out how to deal with this. But for right now, they're on Amazon. So the temple revealed in creation and the temple revealed in the garden. Because I'm laying out for you how the temple functioned in creation, the garden, and currently I'm still working on the temple revealed in Noah's Ark. Okay, question. Okay, yes, those books I have. There's 4 DVDs in there. I sold a bunch last night. I really didn't bring a lot of stuff because I wasn't into it. I don't know what your policy is on Shabbat, so you can take them and send me a check if you want, but I do have 4. So I've got the Bonhoeffer one, 9 parts, and as I said, Donald Trump Jr. has this. Maybe he gave it to his dad, I don't know. So this series, I only have one of these on Revelation, which I think is fabulous. So you guys know Ryan White. He was here. You all know Ryan. He and I decided to do it together because it's much more fun. So we recorded in Israel at Israel TV Network. We sat and we just kind of talked back and forth. And our approach was much more historical. We tried to lay the foundation for you guys. After this season of what I call prophecy porn that we have just been through, if I get one more video from one more prophet, I may scream. Okay? Throw them all out. And I'll give you one example, although I don't think we talked about it on the DVD. But Revelation chapter 9. Remember that one? Really weird. We got locusts and scorpions come out of the abyss. It's all the smoke. And then these weird creatures, and they're wearing these helmets, and they got long hair, and it's like totally weird. What is going on? Okay. So in reality, if you actually know your history, you would know that in Rome, back at that time period, they had these siege engines, and they used these things called ballista stones, and they'd stick them in, and they'd hurl them at the wall, they'd break the wall down. So the siege engines were called scorpions. Okay, and then the leaders of their cohorts or whatever would wear special helmets, and the helmets had long hair on them. Okay, so we will find that pretty much everything in the book of Revelation, though it's written in very metaphorical, apocalyptic language, has its root in something concrete. So here we go. Here's a perfect example of us taking our modern mind and inserting it into what's going on in the book, instead of understanding what that meant to the people back then. So I would submit, and not everybody would agree, but we think the book was probably written, like what everyone says, around 90 Common Era. And incidentally, there was no penal colony. So John was writing about something he knew that took place years earlier, and that would have been the Jewish revolt, 66 to 70 Common Era. So the story of Revelation is the story of the destruction of the temple in 70 Common Era. Everything fits into that. Now, I always get accused of being a preterist for taking that view. I just defy being labeled. If you just look at the, Josephus and people like that, you can see that this perfectly lines up. The greatest, bar none, catastrophe for Israel at any time was the destruction of their temple. Why? It'd be like blowing up the White House and blowing up Congress and removing your government, okay? Because you will be removing your monarch. Your monarch would have no place to sit and rule if you don't have a temple. You would not have the judiciary functioning, which it doesn't function anyways, but that's another story. And so you would have nothing. You would have no commerce. All the institutions functioned within the temple. That was your central location for government. So if you blow that thing up, if it's done, you're done. You don't have a functioning government. And they all sit. I actually have two Bonhoeffers. And this one, the Fire of the Holy Spirit, I did for Shabbat. If you want to know a lot about mountains and the oracles of God and the fire and all that stuff on mountains, this is for you. So these three, the Bonhoeffer and Revelation, are 40, and this one's 25. And like I said, I don't know how you guys do it, but if you want them, just send me it. I'll give you my address. You can send me a check. Okay? And then my books are on Amazon. You can always get them there. Foundations in Torah is my ministry. And if you want to join our prayer teams, just go to onfireprayer.com. Pretty easy, and you can join up with that. And we are, so I'm taking a break. I have a 2-week break here to try to regroup and figure out where God wants to take us next. Where do we go from here? So, yes, sir. I'm just going to tell you that, in my opinion, the whole tribulation stuff that we have in Revelation is dealing with the destruction of the second temple. Hopefully that. I'm not a subscriber. No, I'm not. Don't hold it against me. Listen, one of the most important things for us is to be able to think differently and be happy with that. I'm giving you permission to think whatever way, not whatever way, but you understand, we need to give each other permission to think differently. And it's okay. It doesn't mean we're enemies, right? This is the problem. So I think differently, and I've been labeled everything you can imagine. And my skin is getting thicker. Not as thick as Donald Trump's, but I'm working on it. And so, I don't, but that's okay. I've reached my conclusions based on my 40 years of research. Well, I wasn't really raised that way, so I don't really, I don't really think like that. I was raised in a Gentile school. I mean, I went to Hebrew school, but I was raised in a Gentile world. So God graciously, like Paul, sent me to the Gentiles because it's very difficult in the Jewish world, especially what I'm doing. Like that goes against everything. And Orthodox rabbis are not real happy with women to begin with. So just add this on, and it's kind of difficult. But I'm sure I didn't answer your question on purpose. Anybody else? Okay. Yes. Sure. Okay, so what was the number one issue in the book? What were the people, what was going on? Especially when we look at the 7 churches and stuff. The number one issue was assimilation and compromise. And the question is, how do we live in a world like that now? Because that was, back then, that was no picnic. Nobody in their right mind would want to live in that particular time frame. And so the question is, I should mention the Jews that got out and went to Asia Minor and were over this, they were almost all over those cities in Asia Minor. Laodicea and Ephesus, etc., were run by Jews. You should know that. And they were run by Jews who were very wealthy and were doing quite well and prospering. So there was a quote by Titus at one point at the time, maybe slightly before the Jewish revolt, in which Titus let the priests escape because it was all coming down. And so a lot of these priestly families went to Asia Minor. And then, so you understand that the ecclesia was actually a term for government, as a government term on how to run a city. And so a lot of these Jews ended up running these cities and were very well to do. And what do? They compromised with the culture. This is the biggest battle. They had to compromise with Hellenism and everything that was going on in the culture. Remember, with the Maccabees, all of it. It's the number one issue, and it's always been the same. And so as we read the book, we see here are the consequences of compromising with the culture. You know, you are going to destroy your temple, your city, and everything that you've got if you continue to do this. And so I think that's a really good message for us today. Yeah, I relate that to kingship. The opening of the seals related to the kingship. See, here's the thing. Oh, I didn't want to quite go here, but when you break a covenant, now in the ancient world, if you broke a covenant, the consequences of breaking a covenant were manifested in nature. So when you broke the covenant, it's not like, oh, well, I broke the covenant, you know, who cares? I'm just going to move on. It meant stars falling from the sky, the sun turning dark, the moon not giving its light. When you see those descriptions, those are descriptions, that is the manifestation of a broken covenant where the cosmos begins to collapse. So it's manifested in how the cosmos responds. Does that make sense? So all that stuff you read about all that is a declaration that Israel has broken the covenant with her God. And we are seeing the fruit of that appear, if you will, in how nature operates in the heavens. Yeah, maybe. I mean, I can't get in, you know, sometimes it's just a hurricane and water, you know, out in Africa. So we have to be careful about labeling everything. You know, I mean, I understand God is the author of everything, but we do need to be careful. We are given to assuming things that aren't necessarily the case. But that's how the ancients saw it, for sure. Are we being recorded? I'm not answering it. Sorry. Anyone else? Well, you've all been marvelous and put up with me for over an hour and a half talking. And thank you so much for having me. And like I said, when next time I come, I'll finish my presentation. Right. And or up here if you want.